I raised my son, paid his $60,000 college tuition, and even helped with his $25,000 wedding, only to have him betray me. He and his wife tried to shove me into assisted living and snatch my $650,000 house like I was already gone, but I still had one key, one plan, and one last fight left in me. This was just the beginning. You won't believe what happened next. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. I sat in my living room at 28 Lakeview Drive, the smell of the lake drifting in through the cracked window like cold metal. The late afternoon light stretched across the oak floors, the ones I laid down myself back in 1998. Every board reminded me of those long nights sanding and staining with Maggie, my wife, laughing at how crooked I measured the first row. On the mantel, our wedding photo was still framed in brass, and beside the door, Maggie's red scarf still hung on the hook where she left it last. The walls, though, were lined with boxes now, boxes Tina had labeled in her neat handwriting. Dad's clothes. Dad's books. Dad's miscellaneous. I hated that word, miscellaneous, as if my whole life had become a pile of random things stripped of meaning. I leaned back in my chair, the springs groaning under my weight, and I thought about the ledger of sacrifices I had made for my son Mark. $62,000 for his tuition at Midwestern State. I remember writing those checks one semester at a time, telling him not to worry about the cost, that his job was to study and graduate. $24,500 for his first car, a used Honda Civic that I negotiated for in the dealer's lot, while he stood there with his arms crossed, already acting like he deserved better. $12,800 for the wedding when Tina's parents forgot to pay the deposit on the reception hall. I covered it without a word because I wanted him to start his marriage without debt hanging over his head. Gratitude came in small bursts in those years, a handshake, a nod, a text message that said, "Thanks." But over time, that gratitude hardened into expectation. What I once gave out of love was taken as a duty. I looked around the room, at the house itself, at what it held. Just last year, the appraiser said it was worth $650,000. The taxes were current. The deed was in my name only. The photos on the wall told the story of a family that once smiled easily. The kids by the lake in summer, Maggie in her apron with flour on her cheek, me holding up the biggest vase I ever caught. On the shelf, her pie tins were stacked in a neat tower, scratched and seasoned from decades of use. My old toolbox sat under the window, initials AH, still stamped on the lid, rust at the corners. This house wasn't just real estate. It was a history book written in wood and stone, in recipes and photographs, in the smell of coffee on winter mornings. And yet Mark spoke to me now through calendar invites. Tina spoke in verdicts. They no longer asked me what I wanted. They told me what was next. I remembered the Wednesday when everything shifted. They called it the transition, but it wasn't a conversation. They showed up with a checklist printed in bold type, with little boxes for things like pack toiletries and cancel utilities. On Saturday, they drove me to Maple Ridge, a senior facility that smelled faintly of bleach and apples. The piano in the lobby played itself, keys moving without a hand to touch them. A bowl of green apples sat under a hydration sign, as if fruit could replace dignity. Tina put her hand on my forearm and said softly, "You're doing the right thing." Her voice was sweet enough to rot my teeth, but her eyes never asked. They had already decided. I sat in the passenger seat, breathing the way the hospital taught me after my bypass, slow and steady, trying to calm the thump in my chest. The air in that car was thick, suffocating, heavy with the plans other people had written for my life. That night, after they left me with brochures and fake smiles, my granddaughter Grace slipped into my room. She leaned close and whispered, "I'll ride with them tomorrow, Grandpa. Don't worry." She was young, but she saw more than her parents thought she did. The next morning, when I packed, I chose carefully. 2 suitcases. On top, the expected things: shirts, socks, The little frame photo of Maggie by the lake? On the bottom, hidden away, the things that mattered most. A copy of the deed, a signed inventory list with Mark's and Tina's names scrawled across the bottom. A blank notebook and a pen that could write upside down, the one Maggie gave me after my retirement party. And the old side door key from 1997, nicked from years of use, still working, still mine. And then, like time had bent back on itself, Ray Corson appeared. My old friend from customs, grayer now, slower in step, but the same look in his eyes. He leaned against the doorway and said in that low voice of his, "Arthur, you're still the owner. Then sell it. Don't let them steal what's yours." His words dropped heavy on the floor, as if he'd been waiting years to say them. The first spark of reversal lit inside me when Miles Cordaro came into the picture. A broker, sharp as a tack, but discreet. He talked about a pocket listing, no MLS, quiet showings to the right kind of buyers. He laid out a plan. An accessory dwelling unit built by the buyer, my life lease written into the deed, 90 days of interim housing on the buyer's dime. He said it like a chess move, calm and calculated, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the game was mine to play again. I pulled out the inventory with Mark and Tina's signatures. Their names in ink, their consent recorded. "My things are mine," I said aloud, the words filling the room with a strength I thought I had lost. The decision crystallized when I met with Sarah Lane at the bank. She was efficient, no nonsense, and she confirmed what I already knew. The pods were set correctly, payable on death, untouchable by anyone until my time came. She leaned across the desk and told me about a short-term lease at Lakeside Tower, Unit 7B. 3 months, furnished, elevator access, no thresholds. It wasn't home, but it was safe. And most of all, it was mine, by choice. When I walked back into my house that evening, the red scarf brushed my shoulder as I hung up my coat. I whispered to her, correction, not revenge. I sat down at the kitchen table, phone in hand, and typed out a text to Miles. Just 4 words, but they carried all the weight of my decision, all the anger and love, all the betrayal, and the will to fight back. "Let's start today," I wrote. The send button clicked, final as a hammer on a nail, and I knew then that Chapter 3 of my life, and of this fight, was about to begin. I woke to the hum of the lake and a phone buzzing face down on the nightstand. Miles had sent a message at 6:42 a.m., 2 words that felt like a hand on my shoulder. Game on. I poured coffee into the old blue mug Maggie saved for guests, though it was only me now, and dialed Maple Ridge. Paula answered on the second ring. She is the kind of nurse who never hurries the first hello. I told her I would keep my promise and stop in for a short tour, and then I asked if she could prepare a short capacity note based on her observation of me last week and a fresh conversation this morning. She paused, then said a simple, "Sure, come on in." I could hear her printer warming up through the phone. Little hums mean more than speeches. By 9, I had shaved, ironed a pale shirt, and slid the brown folder into my jacket. On the way out, Maggie's red scarf brushed my knuckles from the hall hook. I touched the wool like a person might touch a friend's shoulder and said the word I had settled on for this season of life. Correction, not revenge. Correction. Maple Ridge does its best to be cheerful. The driveway loops past tidy shrubs and a fountain that murmurs. Someone had set out cups of cucumber water by the front desk. A player piano in the corner ran through a hymn I could hum in my sleep. Paula met me with a printout folded clean in half. She had spoken to me, watched me answer without coaching, and typed the truth. Oriented, lucid, able to understand benefits and risks, capable of informed decisions. She signed with the pen she carries clipped to her pocket, the one that leaves a confident line. She asked if I wanted a copy for my wallet as well as my file. I said yes. Wallet copies change the shape of afternoons. We walked the suite. I nodded at the grab bars and the shower lip. The refrigerator was big enough for leftovers, but not for a life. A man who taught math for 38 years told me the kitchen coffee was passable on Sundays. The activity coordinator asked if I liked cribbage. I said I did. I believe in kindness, and I believe in leaving with what I came for. Paula's note warmed my inside jacket pocket while I shook 2 hands and thanked 3 people I would probably see again. In the parking lot, my phone buzzed. Miles, Thursday, 2 o'clock. Window cleaning, unmarked van. I smiled. In our town, nobody looks twice at a van with ladders. A quiet buyer can stand at a clean pane and see what matters without neighbors building a story before the paint dries. I texted back the only word he needed. Confirmed. By 10:45, I was at Nora's office, the small one with a framed photo of 2 dogs and a giant rubber stamp on the shelf that isn't a toy. Nora is who people call when they want a thing done once. She checked my ID, looked at the deed, and clicked through the county index. Sole owner, she said. No liens apart from the mortgage. Your payoff's clean. She opened escrow, handed me a file number, and printed the forms that would matter in 3 days. We'll need proof of funds from any buyer, and we'll need you to sign a preliminary change of ownership report at closing. She spoke like a person who knows paper is polite when you are, firm when you're not. Before I left, I asked a small question that wasn't small. Can the recorder assign a preliminary number when your packet is queued? Sure, she said, if the intake desk is feeling friendly. She smiled. I know the desk. That afternoon, I made the small covert return to 28 Lakeview that made me feel like a teenager sneaking back after curfew. Shoe covers in my pocket. Miles met me at the side door, and we let ourselves in with the key that has lived under my toolbox since '97. The stove was cold. The sofa still faced the water at the angle Maggie liked, because that is where the light tells the truth at 4 p.m. The scarf had slipped. I set it straight without thinking. Miles walked the rooms the way good brokers do, measuring without a measuring tape, seeing what isn't on a spec sheet. He stood at the slider and looked out. 10 paces off the deck for an ADU pad, he said softly. Porch catching morning light. You could live there and still hear this same water argue with the same wind. I felt the idea seed itself. When a thing wants to be built, it starts talking even before the shovel touches dirt. Thursday arrived like a man who keeps his appointments. The unmarked van rolled up at 2:01. 2 men in ball caps unloaded squeegees, buckets, and the kind of patience that makes them invisible. With them came the first buyer, the one Miles had screened carefully. Howard Knox retired from a tool and dye plant outside Chicago. His handshake told me he had stood on concrete floors. His eyes told me he was done with lake-effect snow. He looked around, the way men who know their minds do. In the kitchen, he glanced at the porch plan Miles had sketched on a notepad. I hate gray, he said. Then he smiled like he already knew the punchline. Outside and in. We walked the yard while the window guys did what they were paid to do. Howard asked a question about footings and another about snow load, even though snow is mostly a memory here. He talked about fishing without a single metaphor. Numbers came up the way they do when both men have decided not to insult the other. 640 to 660, he said, depending on minor repairs. Earnest money of $130,000, wireable today. I nodded because the numbers were fair and the man sounded like his bank would agree. We had a backup because plans like the company. Near the end of daylight, Dr. Robert Kingsley stepped in. Quiet suit, shoes that don't squeak. He teaches history at the college and moves like a person who listens. He called the house a record more than a building. He respected the idea of a life continuing in a small place near what it loves and said he would be honored to be its neighbor. His proof of funds hit Nora's inbox at 5:58. Howard landed 3 minutes later because timing is a sport men play even when they don't admit it. I thanked them both and stood in the doorway after they left, watching the lake lean toward evening in that way it has when it knows you're paying attention. Friday morning, Nora collated the file like a conductor tuning an orchestra. Paula's capacity note on top. The clinic evaluation behind it. The signed inventory with wet ink from Mark and Tina. A clean copy of the deed. 2 bank letters with blunt numbers. She called to confirm that escrow had received the $130,000 in earnest money and parked it under my file number. "We can close Monday at 11, she said. "Bring your ID and whatever pen feels like you." I told her I would, hung up, and let my hand shake a little. Not fear. Electricity is looking for ground. Maple Ridge held a welcome social on Saturday, the nervous kind of party where everyone decides to be cheerful at once. There was lemonade with lemon slices that tried too hard. The pianist started 10 minutes late and then played like the instrument owed him rent. I wore the same pale shirt and a sweater Maggie bought the year I thought I might like golf. People circled with sugar cookies and cataract stories. I watched the door. I watched the clock. I watched the ficus in the corner like a referee watches the line. Mark and Tina walked in together. Mark wore the coached face he uses in meetings. Tina carried brownies as if sugar could grease a machine that had seized for reasons other than friction. I motioned them to the ficus, away from the piano and the punch. I spoke without hurry and without heat. I told them I had sold the house. Tina blinked. Mark set his jaw as if he could press the words into a different shape. I handed him the preliminary recording number Nora had secured from the county's queue, Paula's note, and a 30-day occupant notice for current residents. "Your things are yours," I said. "Mine are mine." The signed inventory says where the line runs. I could feel the room shift, though nobody had agreed to watch. The room heard the news the way rooms do. The first wave is wind. Paper plates stop being still. Conversations go thin at the edges. Someone says the word unbelievable as if it were a prayer. Howard stood 5 feet away because I had asked him to be there for 5 minutes, not as theater, but as gravity. He shook Mark's hand the way decent men shake when the table tilts and said that he would not change a single screw for 30 days while people packed. He meant it. I could hear it clearly. He said nothing after. Then came the second wave. Tina's mother, Agnes, marched in with her purse held high and a single sheet of paper pinched between 2 fingers like it might stain her. She announced that she had discovered a care and management agreement signed by me last month, assigning all property decisions to Mark and Tina for my safety. She used the word safety the way people use a coat to hide a taking. The sheet looked official from across the room. A few faces tilted toward me with doubt they tried to swallow. Agnes read a sentence aloud in a voice that tried to be legal. Mark looked both wounded and relieved, like a man who wants a referee more than he wants a win. I did not raise my voice. I asked to see the paper. It had my name and a signature that looked like a photocopy of someone trying to remember how I write when I am tired. The text bruised itself with sloppy repeats. No notary, no witnesses, the address off by 1 number, and a line that used the phrase, "all powers" twice in 12 words. I set the page on a side table. Then I placed, neatly on top of it, the signed inventory with Mark and Tina's wet signatures from last Saturday and Paula's capacity note dated this morning. Nora had arrived when I texted her 3 words, "Please swing by," and stood back until she was needed. She stepped forward now and introduced herself in the tone teachers use when they like the lesson. "This paper is non-recordable as written," she said, "and it is contradicted by the deed, the inventory, and the medical capacity note. Also, the signature does not match today's notarization standard. She did not accuse. She did not perform. She described a weather pattern and pointed to a window. The room cooled. The tilt is corrected." Agnes sputtered about intentions and family, then remembered a hair appointment that existed only in her mouth. Mark stared at a spot on the carpet where there was nothing to stare at. Tina glanced at her mother, and in that sideways flicker, I saw the next move as clearly as if she had said it out loud. Guardianship. They would take their anxiety to a courthouse where paper wears badges, and they would try to call control a duty. I filed the thought the way an inspector writes down a license plate when the driver is doing the wrong speed in the right lane. Noted, dated, ready. The social fizzled the way lunches do when the fire alarm chirps. People found their coats. A man from the next building told me about the time his sister tried to take his pension and then didn't. I listened because it mattered to him, and because it helped me remember I was not the first or the last to step through this particular weather. Sunday morning, I walked the edge of the lake before church and counted 10 paces off the deck, then 5 more for where the porch would sit, and listened, did the rain the right way. I practiced the route from the kitchen to that spot so it would be muscle memory by spring. Grace called mid-morning to ask if she could help me pack. I told her I had it covered and asked her instead to keep an eye on her mother's calendar for any event with the word hearing in it. She said, "Okay," in the quiet way that tells a child they understand the job. Before we hung up, she whispered that she would ride along if anyone tried to move me on a Wednesday again. I said I knew. At noon, Nora called to confirm that the earnest money was posted and escrow was live, not a promise. We scheduled the closing for Monday at 11. "Bring your ID," she said, "and the patience you used to have when lines at the post office were longer." After we hung up, I drove to Lakeside Tower and signed a 3-month lease for Unit 7B. The manager walked me through the elevator, the ramp, the mailbox that doesn't fight back, and the window that turns late light into something a person can sit with. The rent was fair. The deposit was smaller than the season of aggravation it bought me. I wrote the check and felt a corner of my chest unclench. That night I sat at the small kitchen table and wrote down the names of people who had put a shoulder next to mine. Paula for the note and for speaking plainly. Nora for the backbone and the neat stack. Miles for the van with ladders and the discreet texts. Howard for standing steady in a room that was not his to steady. Kingsley for being willing, if needed. Sarah Lane at the bank for telling me how the pods behaved. Grace for whispering that she would ride along and for actually watching. I added Maggie because a scarf on a hook counts as help when the day goes sideways. I stared at the list until the names felt like studs in a wall. Sleep came the way it does after you stop arguing with your own plan. Monday dawned with frost on the lawn and a text from Miles 5 minutes before I left the house. "Expect pushback," he wrote. "They'll go legal next." I slid the folder into my jacket, thumbed the edge of Paula's note, and answered the text with the line I intended to live by for the rest of the week. "They think I'm weak. They're about to learn I still write, in ink." Then I switched off the kitchen light at 28 Lakeview Drive, pulled the door until the latch clicked, and stepped into the air so clear it made the weather change for good. Here's Chapter 4, written in the same first-person voice and style, carrying forward every beat you specified, guardianship attempt, court defense, stop work lifted, and adding the new minor climax number 2, a forged POA draining the old medical account. I keep dialogue measured and let the narration do the heavy lifting with clear, steady rhythms for voiceover. Monday began with a clock I could feel in my ribs and the sort of gray light that makes a man listen to his own breathing. I drove to Dr. Patel's clinic with my folder on the passenger seat and a promise to myself that whatever he found in there, I would live with the truth. The building looked like it had chosen to be useful instead of pretty. The nurse called my name. I followed her past 2 closed doors that smelled faintly of alcohol wipes and citrus. Dr. Patel shook my hand with the kind of grip that tells you he has delivered both bad news and good news without making either of them more dramatic than they need to be. He asked me where we were, what day it was, and who the governor is. He had me count backward by 7s from 100. He asked me to draw a clock and set it to 10 after 11. He handed me 3 words and took them back 10 minutes later. I told him my medications. I told him who was trying to make decisions that belonged to me. He looked me in the eyes the way a man does when he's checking the pilot light. Then he smiled a small, clean smile and printed a 1-page letter on crisp stock. He signed in blue ink that did not stutter. Capacity affirmed, it said. Patient competent to make legal decisions. He asked if I wanted him to send a copy to my bank and to my title officer. I said yes. He said he already had. When I stepped back into the cold, I put the letter in my inside pocket and felt the world line up by a half-inch. Mallory Title sits 2 blocks from the courthouse, a brick box with a flag that only bothers to wave when the wind has earned the right. Nora met me at the door with a file that could have stopped a sailboat. Howard was already in the conference room. He stood, shook my hand once, and sat with the patience of a man who has kept promises for a living. Nora laid out the pages with the calm of a flight attendant who also designs bridges. Purchase price at $648,000. Earnest money of $130 was wired last Friday. An ADU rider that required the buyer to build a detached, ADA-friendly cottage and to fund 90 days of interim housing for me at Lakeside, all in writing, all in order. 30 days for current occupants to vacate. Personal property retained by the seller per the signed inventory. We signed where the flags told us to sign. Nora checked IDs, stamped the notary seal with that soft kiss title people love, and called the wire desk. She hung up and smiled. "Funded and recorded," she said. 11:43. She slid my packet across as if handing me back the steering wheel I had set down for a minute. Mark and Tina arrived late, winded from the pace of a story that wasn't cooperating. They looked at the neat stacks the way an audience looks at a play that ended before they got their coats off. Nora stayed professional in the way that refuses to be offended on behalf of facts. She gave them courtesy copies of the 30-day notice and the signed inventory. Mark stared at Dr. Patel's letter a second longer than he wanted me to see. Tina read with her lips moving and her jaw tight. "You blindsided us," Mark said. "You taught me how," I answered, not unkindly. Nora kept the temperature steady. "We're complete," she said. "If you have process questions, you're welcome to call," Howard said. Nothing, and that helped more than speeches. I carried the seller's packet out of Mallory like a newborn and drove to Lakeside. The elevator hummed the way big buildings hum when they're feeling reliable. Unit 7B had a view that made the lake look like it had joined the conversation. The kitchen was competent, the bedroom window had the right kind of quiet. I put the deed copy, the rider, the lease, the inventory, and Dr. Patel's letter in the top drawer with the pen that writes upside down. Laurel, the manager, had stocked the fridge with milk, eggs, and a heel of bread that would toast well. I hung Maggie's red scarf on the hook where the morning light patrols. Then I made coffee and let the steam tell me to sit. Grace knocked at 3 with 2 slices of Wonder Bread, a jar of honey, and the kind of smile that makes a building feel friendlier. We ate toast and talked softly. We set Thursday at 2 for the so-called window cleaning. She asked if I felt safe. "Safe enough," I said. She looked at the drawer where I had put my papers and nodded as if to say the word safe has a shape, and it looks like a folder with tabs. The petition hit that afternoon like a horn someone refuses to stop leaning on. The front desk slid a manila envelope under my door with a pink sticky that said from the clerk. Emergency guardianship was denied in bold type, but a hearing was set 2 weeks out. Petitioners: Tina and her parents, Agnes and Carl. Grounds: impaired judgment, undue influence, uncharacteristic financial decisions. The words read like they had been cut from a brochure meant to scare old men. I called Nora. She already had a copy. Of course she did. She asked if I could bring mine over for scanning so we could mark it the way lawyers mark weather on a map. I walked there and back in the clear cold and felt taller on the return trip. After dinner, Laurel knocked again, apologetic. A bank envelope had come to the desk. I opened it at the table because there are some things you do sitting down. At the top was an account number I had not thought about in years. During Maggie's bad months, we opened a small joint account for chemostorms, a rainy day pot we fed with whatever was left when the week was honest. 42,000, the number that once meant air. The notice said withdrawal to 0 2 days ago. The method, a durable power of attorney presented at a branch. The signature was mine, only to someone who had never met my hand. The address on the form was not mine. The copies were retained by the branch as a gift. For a moment, I felt my chest go tight in a way that old men hate. I put my palm over the paper the way you calm a good dog. Paper lies, I said out loud, and I was surprised to hear how even my voice was. The law doesn't, I called Sarah Lane, my banker. She listened, then told me she had already received Dr. Patel's letter that morning and had already locked whatever could be locked. She promised me a formal letter on bank letterhead describing the forged power, the branch log, the copies held, and the freeze placed on further activity. She said she would message Nora directly. She did not try to make the facts feel smaller or larger. She let them be themselves. I thanked her. When I hung up, I put the notice in the drawer with the others and closed it like a man setting a tool down in the right place. Sleep came badly and left early. Miles texted at dawn. "Come by the yard. Bring your calm." I drove to Lakeview and parked in front like a guest. A red paper on a sawhorse greeted me with that municipal tone that believes it can scare competence. Stop work, anonymous complaint, setbacks, wetlands. Julia, the architect, stood with her clipboard and her boots that had seen mud. A young inspector held a tablet like a shield. He said he had to post it. Policy, he said, is like a person who wants to be on a team but isn't sure which one wins today. Julia nodded. Policy keeps buildings standing, she told him. We like policy. She called Carla in the city, the senior who knows where the survey pins live. Howard handed out coffee without making a show of it. We waited with the patience of people who have done their homework. Carla arrived just before lunch. She scraped a little dirt with the toe of her shoe until the metal cap winked like a coin. She checked the other corner, looked at the lake, checked the setback on Julia's plan, and scrolled through the photos the young inspector had taken last week when he admired the forms and the care. She pinched the red paper between two fingers and peeled it off like a bad bandage. Then she wrote, "In compliance," on a sheet from her pad and handed it to me. "Post this," she said. I did. The wind stopped acting important. A Subaru's curtain flicked and went still. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 1 below to let me know you're here with me. On my way back to 7B, I stopped at the library because Anne had left a message for me. She met me under the big clock with a frown she reserves for people who mistake anonymity for virtue. The anonymous complaints, she said, had been filed from a public terminal the night before. She had posted a small sign reminding patrons that privacy is not a costume for mischief and that the library cooperates with lawful requests. I told her libraries save more people than they incriminate. She finally smiled and invited me to a photo exhibit of the lake in winter. "I'll bring my granddaughter with the straight staples," I said, and she laughed. When I reached my door, there was an envelope from Nora and a text that said, "Open on speaker." Inside was the bank's letter from Sarah. It described the forged durable power of attorney, the mismatched signature, the mismatched address, the copies retained, and the freeze. Nora had filed it as Exhibit B with a motion asking the court to dismiss the guardianship petition outright. Exhibit A was Dr. Patel's capacity letter. She had couriered a courtesy copy to the petitioner's lawyer because good process spares everyone time. She had also emailed the county attorney's office to let them know a bank would cooperate if they wished to look closer. "Chain of custody is a gift," she said. "We won't wrap it in ribbon." Mark called at dusk. He sounded like a man standing in a room full of boxes that had forgotten what they used to be. He said he had not known about the petition. He said he was angry with the wrong people and sorry to find out the hard way. I told him to show up at the hearing and tell the truth. That would be enough, I said. He asked if I needed money. I told him I needed him to remember where the line is and help his wife see it without turning it into another argument. He said he would try. I told him that trying is what boys do. He went quiet and said, "I'll do it." We hung up before either of us tried to fix the old years in one call. The days between were a rhythm. Julia measured and cut under a tarp while a kind rain rehearsed on the roof of the main house. Howard brought a thermos of coffee that tasted like a hardware store in the best way. Grace stopped by and replaced the smoke detector batteries because she likes doing things that make a day sound safer. She drew a small floor plan of the cottage and labeled a square, "Grandpa's Porch." We set a chair on the staked rectangle and moved it 2 inches at a time until the imaginary roof made the sound I could already hear if I closed my eyes. I wrote a short note to Maggie in my little notebook and tucked it under the deed copies in the drawer. "Correction, not revenge," I wrote again, as if the pen could memorize it for me. Friday was court. I wore a pale shirt, and the tie Grace said made me look like I could read a map. Nora met me outside Department 4 with a binder that refused to sag. The courtroom smelled like wood polish and coffee. The judge carried a folder like a person who knows paper is stronger than volume. Tina sat with a lawyer whose suit was louder than his facts. Agnes and Carl sat behind her with their faces set in permanent expressions. Mark sat on my side, back straight, hair damp, a boy and a man at the same time. The clerk called the case. The lawyer spoke first about patterns and vulnerability and family duty. He did not offer a date or a document, only adjectives, trying to get promoted to facts. Nora stood when it was our turn and did not raise her voice. She handed up Dr. Patel's letter. The judge read it and initialed the margin. She handed up the recorded deed and the rider with the ADU conditions. The judge scanned my life estate language and nodded once. Then she slid the bank letter toward the clerk. The judge read it slowly, the way people read numbers when numbers matter. He looked at Tina's lawyer. "Counsel," he said. The lawyer said something about protection again and tried to turn the forged power into a misunderstanding. He could not explain why the signature did not match, or why the address was wrong, or why branch copies exist at all if a thing is honest. Tina spoke out of turn and said the money had been sitting and bills had to be paid. She said, "Protect me 3 times in 2 minutes." The judge lifted a hand. "The statute is a shield," he said, "not a sword." He asked if the original durable power existed. The lawyer did not have it. The judge closed the folder. "Petition denied," he said from the bench with a voice that did not need to get louder to carry. He found that the emergency request had been denied earlier in the week for good reason, and that the new papers did nothing to disturb my right to make my own decisions. He added a short sentence referring to the bank's letter to the county attorney for review and possible investigation, not because he wanted drama, but because he wanted the law to do its job all the way to the corners. He wished the parties good luck and better conversations and called the next case. Nora exhaled softly. Agnes did not. Tina stood so fast her chair scraped. Mark did not move until I did. We walked into the hallway where the wood smelled better than it had an hour earlier. Mark met my eyes the way a man finally does when he decides he has run out of detours. He said he was sorry, not for show, for weight. I told him we would save that word for a kitchen table with spaghetti on it so it could land somewhere useful. He nodded. Tina looked at her phone like it might start telling a different truth if she refreshed it often enough. Agnes swept past with a smile that forgot how smiles work. Carl stared at the floor as if the carpet could sign affidavits. Nora touched my elbow, not to steady me, but to steer me toward the clerk for stamped copies. I thanked the clerk like a person thanks a medic who knows where the bandages are. Back at 7B, I slid the stamped order into the drawer beside the bank letter, the deed, the rider, the lease, the inventory, and Dr. Patel's page. The lake made its small argument with the shore the way it always does after a day that tries too hard. Howard texted that Julia wanted me at the yard at 10 in the morning to set the depth of the porch roof. "You're almost home," he wrote. I believed him. I set the phone face down and made tea and watched the steam climb like a thought that finally knows where it's going. Saturday, the air was clear. I carried a tape measure to the yard because carrying a tool still feels like permission to belong. Julia had the strings humming over the grass. She had me move a chair 3 inches and then 2 more until the roof would make the sound I wanted when rain comes, the soft consonant that says, "Stay." Howard watched the light and nodded once. Mark arrived in boots that had not seen a Saturday in years and asked what he could hold. Julia put a board in his hands and told him to keep it steady. He did. It felt like a sentence a man can keep. By noon, the porch line looked inevitable. Julia said the inspector would come on Monday to bless the holes, and we could pour concrete by Wednesday if the weather behaved. She held out 3 stain samples in the sun. I chose the one that looked like morning. "Good choice," she said. She always says that when she wants a client to trust his eyes. We ate sandwiches Howard brought and avoided the topics that had already been told where to go by the court. We talked about gutters and birds and the way the wind shifts on that edge of the lake. When I went back to 7B, I wrote a short line to Maggie in the little notebook. "They tried to take my mind," I wrote. "Then they tried to take your money. They just handed me the cleanest paper in town." That night, Nora sent a photo of the signed order granting her motion to dismiss with the clerk's neat notation in the corner. She added a short sentence she rarely uses. "Proud of you." I typed and deleted a few replies and settled on, "Thank you for knowing what day it is when other people pretend not to." Then I put the phone away and sat in quiet. I hung Maggie's scarf straight on the hook. I set the stamped order under the small plant to level the table. I left the pen pointed north in the drawer. I told myself not to gloat. Let paper do the talking. Let the house rise. Let your spine be taller than your voice. I turned out the light and slept with the window cracked to let the building breathe with me. Morning brought a soft wind off the water and the feeling you get when a long train of small right decisions finally pulls into the station and sighs. I opened the drawer and ran my fingers over the edges in order. Deed, rider, lease, capacity letter, bank letter, court order, clean paper that will last longer than the volume. I whispered to the red scarf on the hook because I still talk to the woman who taught me how to keep corners true. "We are almost home, Maggie," I said. "The roof will make the right noise. The porch will listen. The lake will keep telling the truth in a small voice, the only voice truth trusts." Then I locked the drawer, picked up the tape measure, and went to meet the morning at the yard. The morning the porch passed inspection, I felt something in my chest unclench that had been locked for years. Carla, the senior inspector with hair silver as wire, came up the steps holding her clipboard and a smile that was half business, half kindness. She looked over Julia's measurements, tapped the posts with the blunt end of her pen, and ran her hand along the rail like a piano player, making sure the keys still sang. She tore the approval slip from her pad, signed it with a flourish, and handed it to me. "Let the house be itself," she said. It was such a plain sentence, but it landed like scripture. For months, maybe years, I'd been fighting to make sure this house could stay itself, and that I could stay myself inside it. We moved back from 7B that same afternoon. It didn't take much. 2 suitcases, the box of records Maggie loved, the old turntable that still hummed before the first note, a cast-iron skillet blackened by 30 winters of fried potatoes, and her photo from the lake in '91 when the kids were small and life still carried its sweetness right on the surface. That was all I needed. Everything else I'd already chosen to let go, and letting go made the load lighter than I thought it could ever be. The porch creaked the way wood should creak, like it remembered storms and laughter. I carried each piece in myself, step by step, slow enough to feel what it meant to come home again. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment too below to let me know you're here with me. By the weekend, the community began showing up. Ray came first, grinning, holding a bag of felt pads for the chair legs and a carpenter's level, like a man arriving at a barn raising. He didn't need an invitation. He just set the pads on the floor and started sticking them under table legs until everything sat steady. Nora followed the next day with papers in a neat leather folio. She spread them out on the kitchen table and explained in her calm, precise way what each one meant. "A recorded covenant," she said, "guaranteeing that my little ADU would always have rights to light, water, and peace." If anyone ever tried to demolish it after my life estate, the buyer would be required to donate equivalent value to the library's heating fund. I laughed, shook my head, and told her Maggie would have loved that detail. Nora just smiled. "That's the point," she said. The numbers looked sharp on paper. The ADU had been built at the buyer's expense, about $120,000 to the ledger. The interim rent at Lakeside had been covered in full. It was all there in black and white. I had given up the big house, yes, but I had gained something harder to measure, a place that fit the life I have now, and a porch that sounded like rain should sound when it lands where it belongs. Sarah from the bank called to confirm the escrow down payment had cleared, $130,000 posted without a hitch. She also mentioned, almost as an aside, that she had arranged a short anonymous rent assistance for Birch Street, the property Mark and Tina were moving into. 90 days, quiet and clean so they could find their footing. She didn't need to do it, but she did, and I didn't stop her. Howard, who already owned Birch Street, offered them what he called a dignity discount if they wanted to stay long-term. I decided not to mention that part. Some gifts are better left to unfold on their own. The guardianship case dissolved like fog under the sun. A notice arrived from the court. Dismissed without prejudice. That was all it said, and it was all it needed to say. Alongside it, Sarah's fraud unit opened a case on the forged power of attorney. Tina didn't call for a week after that, and for the first time in months, my phone sat quiet in a way that felt like music. The silence had weight, but not the wrong kind. It was the silence of doors shutting properly, not slamming. Mark showed up one morning wearing an old rain jacket of mine, the green one I'd kept in the garage for years. He picked up a 2x4, stood by the porch frame, and asked Julia where she needed him. She didn't look at me. She looked straight at him and said, "Sink that nail straight." He did. When he set the hammer down, he turned to me, eyes tired. "I can't give back what I took," he said. I looked at him for a long moment, then answered, "Be different. That's how apologies work." He nodded. The air between us didn't suddenly heal, but it stopped hurting quite as much. Even Agnes bent a little. She came by with a tin of shortbread, hands trembling slightly, and said, "I thought safety meant control." I poured her coffee, stirred in cream the way she liked, and told her, "Safety is letting someone else make coffee without moving the spoons." She actually smiled at that, just a flicker, but it was real. We sat there, not friends, but not enemies either, and that was enough for me. Grace, my granddaughter, was the one who found Maggie's sealed letter. She had been digging through the photo box one rainy afternoon, pulling out pictures and scraps of notes when she held up an envelope with my name written in Maggie's careful slanted hand. It was notarized 13 years ago, sealed shut with the weight of time. I opened it slowly. Her words spilled out like they'd been waiting in the dark for light. "For when the house is too big," she had written, "build a little place. Hear the roof sound right. Give the kids a smaller space if they turn into their fears. Tell Ray he was right about the correction. Tell me you kept the corners." My eyes blurred, and I pressed my palm against the wall, whispering back to her, "Enough." That single word, carved once on scrap lumber, was still the truest thing I had. Life started to settle into rhythms that felt more like music than noise. Mark and Tina signed the lease for Birch Street. I smelled sauce cooking all day when I stopped by, garlic and tomatoes, the scent of trying to make a house into a home again. Evan, my grandson, helped wire a speaker on the porch. He got it wrong the first time, sparks spitting when he flipped the switch, but on the second try, it played clean. Grace took a part-time job at Nora's office, scanning documents and learning that dates tell the truth better than gossip ever could. One morning, Grace hung Maggie's red scarf by my door, right where the light pours in at dawn. It swung gently in the soft breeze, catching the glow, almost alive. Later that day, a gentle rain began to fall, tapping the roof of the porch with exactly the sound Maggie had promised me in her letter. I stood there with my coffee, listening, and for the first time in a long time, I felt peace roll through me like a tide that had finally decided to come in. When the porch was christened, it wasn't with champagne, but with Ella Fitzgerald on the turntable and lemon bars Beth had baked. Howard leaned on the rail like a father watching his kids on a good day. Ray told one of his old custom stories, and everyone laughed the way people laugh when the past doesn't sting anymore. I sat back in my chair, the scarf catching the last of the evening light, and thought, I didn't burn anyone's house down. I right-sized my own. The porch became more than wood and nails. It became a line in the sand, a place where dignity returned. My children had tried to take control, to fold me into paperwork and plans that weren't mine. But now, standing on that porch, I realized I had turned their scheme into something different. Correction, not revenge. Maggie's words again, true as ever. Mark stopped by often after that, sometimes with Tina, sometimes without. He didn't talk much, but when he did, the words carried weight. Tina stayed polite, distant, but not sharp anymore. She signed papers, cooked meals, and went about her life. I didn't press. Some relationships mend slowly, if at all. That was her choice. My choice was not to bend myself into something smaller just to keep her comfortable. The bank sent updates on the forged POA case. Investigators confirmed what we already knew. It was Tina who had filed it, with her mother standing by. The case would wind its way through the channels, maybe with penalties, maybe not. That part no longer sat heavily on me. My job had been to put the truth in the light. The law would carry it from there. Agnes stopped by once more before winter, carrying another tin of cookies. She didn't apologize exactly, but she didn't have to. She admitted she had confused safety with control, that she had pushed her daughter into things out of fear of being left behind herself. I nodded, let her words stand, and didn't need to add much. Sometimes the absence of bitterness is an apology enough. I began to fill my days with small, steady things. I joined the library's Thursday history group, where people talked about the town's past as if it were still breathing. I walked by the lake in the mornings, listening to the cold water slap the rocks. I planted 2 tomato vines in barrels on the porch and laughed when the first fruit came out lopsided. Grace visited often, always bringing something small, a doodle she had sketched in the margin of her notes, a book she thought I'd like, a story from Nora's office that showed her how people twist the truth and how paper untwists it again. Mark and I built a rhythm, too. He held boards, hammered nails, and carried groceries. He didn't say sorry again. He didn't need to. His actions were the apology, slow and steady, the kind you can lean on. I drew firmer boundaries. When Tina tried to call one evening to explain herself, I let it go to voicemail. She wanted to apologize, perhaps, or maybe justify. Either way, I didn't need it. I whispered to myself as the phone stopped ringing, I don't need them anymore. I have myself. The words weren't cruel. They were free. What happened to them afterward wasn't mine to manage. They moved into Birch Street, and I heard through Ray that money was tight. They had to cut corners, sell Tina's SUV, and shop with coupons. They were still together, a family, but the shine had dulled. That was their path, not mine. Mine was the porch, the scarf, the soft rain on the roof. The lesson sat clear as a bell. Family is not a blood right. Family is respect. If you can't give that, you don't deserve the other parts. The truth always rises. Maybe it rises slowly, maybe it rises through paper and ink and hearings and banks, but it rises. And when it does, you get to stand on your porch with a cup of coffee and know you fought the good fight without losing yourself. One evening, as the sun dropped low and the sky went pink, I whispered to Maggie's scarf, I finally let go of the weight. I finally chose myself. The scarf didn't move, but I swear the air felt lighter. Life is quieter now, and that quiet is a gift. I wake without dread. I fall asleep without planning a defense. I know the house is protected, the porch is mine, and the law has done what it should. I also know the future isn't empty. Grace keeps telling me about a community project she wants me to join, scanning Old Town records for the Historical Society. Maybe I'll do it. Maybe I'll sit at a long table under fluorescent lights, digitizing paper that once held people's lives. That sounds right. That sounds like a future that builds instead of defends. As I close this chapter of my life, I carry no gloating, only relief. They tried to erase me with paper. I answered with a stronger paper. They tried to shrink me into their plans. I built something smaller but truer instead. The porch stands. The roof makes the right sound in the rain. Maggie's scarf glows red in the morning light. And I, at last, am enough. The mornings began to carry a new kind of silence, the good kind, the kind that tells you you've finally stepped out of the storm. I would sit on the porch with a strong cup of coffee, honey drizzled over toast from the local farm stand, and listen to the roof make the note Julia promised me it would make when the boards were set right. It was a soft hum, almost like a string pulled just enough to sing but not enough to break. I breathed with that note, steady, certain, letting it remind me that life had found its rhythm again. The porch became the center of my days. It wasn't grand, it wasn't expensive, but it was mine. Maggie's red scarf still hung by the door, catching the first line of sun. I would touch it lightly as I walked out each morning, a silent greeting to the woman who had believed in correction over revenge before I ever understood what those words really meant. At night, I would sit in the same spot with a blanket over my knees and a record spinning Goodman or Fitzgerald, the crackle in the grooves reminding me that old things, when cared for, still play sweetly. Part of my new life was the covenant written into the deed. Each month, I set aside time to volunteer at the library's Winter Heat Fund. Nora had suggested it when she drafted the clause, and I found myself grateful she had thought that far ahead. In January, Howard's Foundation mailed a check for $1,000, a tidy sum to keep the radiators warm in the children's reading room. I carried the envelope to the desk, slid it across to the librarian, and watched her eyes widen. "That will mean a lot this year," she whispered. I smiled, not because I had done something large, but because the house itself had. The covenant made the house into a giver, and I was simply the keeper of its generosity. As for Mark and Tina, they managed to settle into Birch Street. It wasn't the house they had once schemed to take, but it was a house nonetheless. No granite counters, no lake view, just a modest place where walls didn't echo with old arguments. From what Ray told me, their conversations grew calmer, less sharp. Maybe necessity softened them. Maybe losing what they thought they deserved taught them to be grateful for what they had. I didn't ask, and I didn't need to. Tina sent me a text one Sunday evening, just a line. "I'm sorry for everything." I read it twice, maybe 3 times, before answering. My fingers didn't shake. I typed slowly, "We can talk on Sundays. No paperwork, no surprises." That was the line I chose, and I held to it. A boundary, firm but not cruel. She never pressed beyond it. Agnes and Carl kept to themselves, too. The town forgot the noise faster than pride ever does, but eventually even pride learns to quiet down when no one is listening. Then came a small invitation I hadn't expected. Anne from the senior clinic asked if I would come speak to a group about paper as a shield. I laughed when I heard the phrase, but the truth of it rang clear. I gathered the documents, inventory sheets signed in ink, the capacity letter from Dr. Patel, the fraud alert from the bank, and held them in a neat folder. I didn't make a speech. I just told my story. I said paper can lie, but paper can also protect if you keep it clean and straight. Afterward, a man about my age came up and whispered, "My son tried the same." We stood there, 2 old men in worn jackets, talking softly about betrayal and boundaries, about how the law may be slow, but it can still move like water through stone if you keep pressing. He gripped my shoulder as we parted, and I realized that telling the story wasn't just for me. It was for every parent who had been told by their own children that age meant surrender. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 3 below to let me know you're here with me. Life began to feel softer. The porch rail needed sanding, so I spent an afternoon with sandpaper and oil, letting my hands remember the work. Grace came by often, stapler in hand, practicing at Nora's office, proud when she managed a straight line of clips. We cooked together on Saturdays, sometimes spaghetti with sauce that bubbled all afternoon, sometimes simple grilled cheese and tomatoes, the way Maggie used to make on winter nights. The smell of butter on the pan, the sound of bread crisping, these were my new treasures. One afternoon, Tina mailed a longer letter. I could see her handwriting through the envelope, familiar and yet changed. I set it in a drawer, the same drawer where I kept Maggie's old recipe cards, and decided not to open it. Not yet, maybe not ever. I whispered to myself, I don't need their apology. I have my life. And it was true. Keeping the letter unopened was not bitterness. It was freedom. My peace did not depend on words she might have written. My peace depended on the life I chose to live each morning. That night, I wrote a page to Maggie, just for myself. The corners hold, the roof sings, we did it. I left the paper on the mantel under her photo. The next morning, the light caught it just so, and I knew she would have understood. There are lessons in all of this, ones I hope others hear. For parents, the lesson is simple but hard. Don't sacrifice every piece of yourself for your children if they don't show respect in return. Love them, yes, but keep a part of yourself guarded, a part that reminds them you're not a wallet or a deed, but a person with dignity. For children, the lesson is this: what you think you are owed can vanish if you forget gratitude. Parents may give and give, but when you take without honor, you lose more than money. You lose the very bond that makes family worth having. And for people living in this modern world, the lesson cuts even deeper. We are surrounded by contracts, by screens, by paper that can be twisted into lies. But character, real character, still shows up in the choices we make when no one is watching. A small surprise came to me one week in spring. The mail brought a letter not from Tina, but from my cousin Harold, a man I hadn't heard from in over 20 years. He had read about my story in the county paper, some brief note about the guardianship case being dismissed. His letter was short but warm, saying he'd always admired Maggie, that he was sorry for the distance, that maybe we should share a coffee before too much more time passed. I sat with that envelope a long time before answering. Some doors stay closed, but some can open without harm. I wrote back the next morning, saying yes, let's have that coffee. It wasn't about repairing everything lost, it was about choosing what still had life in it. My days found their shape. Mornings on the porch, afternoons at the library or with Grace, evenings with music and small meals. The roof sang in the rain, the scarf glowed in the sun, and I felt myself lighter than I had been in decades. The house, though smaller, held all I needed. Each object had a story. The skillet black with memory, the records worn but proud, the scarf that never stopped catching light. Even the silence had weight, but it was the right weight, the kind that steadies you instead of pressing you down. As for Mark and Tina, they stayed in Birch Street. I passed by once on a walk and saw Mark trimming the hedge while Tina held a basket of laundry. They looked ordinary, not desperate, not triumphant, just ordinary. And that was fitting. The life they had wanted to seize from me had become a life they had to build for themselves. Agnes and Carl grew quieter, showing their faces less often around town. The scandal faded, but reputations leave shadows. That was theirs to carry. I kept my line of separation. When Tina's second letter arrived, I did not answer. Boundaries are not cruel. They are kindness to yourself. I had given enough, and I had corrected enough. The rest belonged to them. My independence was not negotiable. One evening, soft rain began to fall, tapping the porch in a rhythm that sounded like a drummer winding down. I leaned back, hands folded, and watched the scarf sway just enough in the draft. It felt like Maggie was answering me, saying, yes, this is what peace feels like. I whispered aloud, I'm home. Not because the house is mine, but because my life is. That is the heart of it all. correction over revenge, writing things down so the truth has a spine, keeping the corners of your life sharp and true, choosing your porch, whatever that may look like, and leaving space for mercy without surrendering your dignity. That is how you survive betrayal without letting it rot you from the inside. That is how you teach your children, if they will listen, that respect is the only inheritance that matters. As the rain slowed and the evening deepened, I felt the story close around me, not heavy, but complete. My journey was not about winning against them. It was about not losing myself. And in that, I had succeeded. The story has come to an end. I hope it has brought you valuable lessons and insights. If you enjoyed this content, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next video. Goodbye, and see you again.